It was 1996 when Texas pathologist Beck Weathers joined a group of 8 ambitious climbers who wanted to reach the world's highest peak, Mount Everest. Weathers already had experience in the practice and participated in an undertaking to reach the 7 Peaks, a mountaineering adventure that involved reaching the summit of the highest mountain on each continent. Until that moment, he had completed only one guided ascent, that of the Vinson Massif in Antarctica. Everest would be his second. He was ready to devote all his energy to this climb and would do his best for it. After all, he felt he had nothing to lose, but his wife, infuriated by his devotion to mountain climbing during their 20-year marriage, had already threatened to leave him before completing the climb. And this time she assured that as soon as she returned from Everest, the marriage would really end. Weathers, unconcerned by this and dogged by his dream of conquering the highest peaks around the world, decided to make a memorable ascent, throwing all the caution of that adventure to the wind. However, this particular wind hovered at an average temperature of -30 degrees and blew at a speed of up to 250 kilometers per hour. Even so, the adventurer was ready for the mission on May 10, 1996. The expedition was headed by veteran Rob Hall, an experienced climber, originally from New Zealand, who had formed an adventure climbing company and who had already climbed Everest 5 times. So 8 climbers set off that May morning for the summit of Everest. The weather was clear, they felt good omens as they set off on the long adventure, but before long, Weathers and his team would realize just how brutal the mountain could be. "Are you ready for this, Beck?" Rob Hall, the expedition leader, asked with a serious expression on his face. Beck nodded, even as his heart pounded in his chest. "I'm ready, Rob. I'm here to rise to the challenge." Rob smiled, but there was concern in his eyes. "Remember, Beck, Everest is unpredictable. We have to be prepared for everything," he said to everyone on the team, including veteran climbers, even those venturing out there for the first time. As they took their first steps, Beck felt a mixture of emotions, excitement, fear, and determination. He knew the climb would be difficult, but he was determined to reach the summit no matter what the cost. "It's amazing to be here, isn't it, Beck?" asked Doug Hansen, one of his teammates, as they climbed a steep slope later that first day. Beck looked at the horizon, marveling at the grandeur of the landscape that stretched out before them. "It's really something special, Doug. I can't wait to see what else Everest has to offer." As they made their way up the mountain, Beck and his team set up camps at higher and higher altitudes to help their bodies acclimate to the rarefied air. Each night brought with it new challenges, from the struggle to set up the tents on unstable ground to the freezing temperatures that penetrated their bones. But until that moment, everything seemed perfect. The bodies were getting used. While in the base camps, they had fun with other climbers who told stories of different climbs and challenges around the world. Meanwhile, during the day, they went on acclimatization hikes, climbing to higher altitudes before returning to the camps to rest and recuperate. The thin air made breathing difficult, and each step required Herculean effort. As the expedition progressed, Beck began to feel the first signs of altitude sickness, headache, lack of appetite, and difficulty sleeping. But he knew these were common symptoms of acclimatization and tried not to worry too much about them. They were just a slight nuisance close to what he intended to achieve. On the first night at the highest acclimatization camp at more than 5,000 meters altitude, the team faced a sudden storm that left them huddled in their tents, praying that the ropes that held them to the ground would resist the force of the wind that roared all over the mountain, as if it wanted to drive them away from their domain. "Rob, do you think the tents will hold?" Beck asked that night, worried about the rumbling sound of the wind outside. Rob Hall, the expedition leader, looked up at the dark sky through the opening of the tent, his face tense with concern. "We have to rely on the resilience of our equipment and stick together until the storm passes." During that endless night, Beck could barely sleep, as he and his crew clung to each other, seeking comfort and safety in each other's presence as the wind howled around them. Each gust made the tents shake and ice accumulate on the walls, but they refused to give in to fear, remaining steadfast in their determination to survive. When the storm finally passed and the sun rose on the horizon, Beck and his team emerged from their tents, exhausted and shivering from the cold, but relieved to have survived another night on the unforgiving slopes of Everest. "We're alive, guys," Rob said that morning, trying to cheer up the team that seemed frightened at the ferocity of the mountain, his voice hoarse from the effort. "Now we're going to keep climbing and show this mountain what we're made of." And so, with heavy hearts and resilient spirits, Beck and his team continued their journey toward the summit of Mount Everest, knowing that each step brought them closer to their ultimate goal. That would be the last acclimatization climb. After that, they would rest, and if the weather allowed, they would climb the slope the next morning. The last acclimatization climb was a success, and that night the weather seemed to cooperate. The sky was clear, which meant that the climb was approaching. And so, the next morning, with the weather firm and everyone on their feet, they began what would be the last ascent of many there. As they made their way down the trail, Beck found himself in the midst of a diverse group of climbers, each with their own story and motivation for taking on the challenge of Everest. Lively conversations echoed through the thin air, mixed with the constant sound of crampons digging into the snow. "How are you feeling, Beck?" Doug Hansen asked as they paused to rest. Beck smiled, trying to ignore the feeling of exhaustion that was already beginning to set in.
Infine, Doug.
"Just trying to keep up." Doug nodded, but Beck could see the determination in his eyes. Both shared the same goal, to reach the summit and prove to themselves that they were able to overcome any obstacles. As they climbed higher and higher, the landscape around them began to change, turning into a desolate and unforgiving world of ice and rock. The air became thinner, making breathing more and more difficult. "We're almost there, guys," Rob exclaimed, his voice echoing in the wind. "We will keep up the pace and reach the summit soon." But fate had other plans. Shortly before the climb, Beck had undergone routine surgery to correct a nearsightedness problem. However, the altitude further deformed his corneas that were still recovering, leaving him almost completely blind with each meter climbed. When Hall found that he could no longer see, he forbade him to continue climbing the mountain, ordering him to remain on the side of the trail while leading the others to the top. On the way back, Weathers would be rescued. Reluctantly, he agreed. Rob never came back. As they approached the summit, a violent storm began to form on the horizon, enveloping the mountain in a curtain of snow and ice. The wind howled furiously, causing the climbers to bend under its force. "Rob, I think we should consider going back," suggested one of the team members, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Rob hesitated for a moment, looking up at the dark sky above them. "It will take time," he spoke, hurrying everyone to reach the top of the world. Upon reaching the summit, one team member became too weak to continue. Refusing to abandon him, Hall chose to wait for him, but eventually succumbed to the cold and perished on the slopes. To this day, his body remains frozen just below the South Dome. Weathers, who had been abandoned, noticed the delay and noticed something was wrong as the storm roared down the mountain. But despite fears, he remained loyal to the team even after another caravan informed him that Hall was waiting for the weather to improve with one of the team members. It only took another turn when Mike Room, Hall's team leader, showed up. Together with him and other team members, they returned to descend, but were surprised by a new snowstorm, which left visibility even lower. The storm soon worsened, turning into a whirlwind of wind and snow that seemed to want to devour them alive. Visibility became almost non-existent for everyone groping through the white desert, and Beck could barely see a foot in front of him. When he realized it, there was no sign of his teammates. "I'm lost, Beck," Doug shouted, his voice full of panic. Beck approached, following his companion's screams, and grabbed Doug's hand, trying to hold on despite the sense of despair that threatened to consume him. "Let's stay together and find our way back." As they struggled to find their way back to base camp, the storm continued to roar around them, throwing them into a maze of ice and rock. The cold was unbearable, penetrating his bones and freezing his limbs. "We can't go on like this, Beck," Doug said, his voice weak and trembling. "We need to find shelter before it's too late." Beck agreed, his mind spinning with exhaustion and cold. "We will try to find somewhere to shelter until the storm passes." With difficulty, without being able to locate the other members of the team, they managed to find a ledge in the rock that offered some protection from the wind. They huddled together, wrapping themselves in their sleeping bags in hopes of surviving the night. Hours passed, each moment a desperate struggle for survival. Beck felt like he was on the edge of the abyss, struggling to stay conscious as the insidious cold threatened to drag him into darkness. "Beck, I don't know how much more I can take," Doug said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. As the night dragged on, Beck felt himself sinking into a state of lethargy, his mind oscillating between consciousness and torpor. He knew he needed to fight, that he needed to find a way to survive, but every fiber of his being cried out for rest. "Beck, I can't feel my hands anymore," Doug said, his voice almost a whisper. Beck desperately tried to concentrate, forcing himself to remain alert despite the temptation to surrender to sleep. "Stay with me, Doug. We need to stay alive tonight." But the storm showed no signs of abating, and in the midst of the wind that almost carried them away, Beck was thrown by a gust of wind that threw him into the snow, causing him to lose his gloves in the darkness, leaving him to be frozen alive, lost in the terrible blizzard of Everest, while Doug's screaming no longer found him. The next day, when everything slowed down and the mountain roared calmly again, a Russian guide climbed alone and rescued the rest of his team, who were scattered within a radius of only 100 meters, but who due to snow and storm could not find each other. Weathers was also miraculously found still alive, but was deemed unsaved and, as is customary among people who die on Everest, he was left behind. Left for dead, Beck could barely articulate his thoughts, His mind was lethargic, and the only urge he had was to close his eyes and finally rest. But as suddenly, in his last breath of life, he rose. Visibility was almost zero, and the thin air made breathing difficult. Beck felt the pressure in his lungs and the burn of the cold on his exposed skin. The feeling of despair was overwhelming, but he refused to give up. He had come there with a purpose, and he would let nothing and no one stop him from achieving his goal. While battling the fatal elements of nature, Beck found himself haunted by dark thoughts. He thought of his family back home, his wife and children who had been left behind as he ventured on top of the world. He wondered if it was worth risking everything for a personal achievement, if any summit was worth the sacrifice of his own life. However, these thoughts were quickly driven away by the survival instinct. Beck knew he couldn't let fear and uncertainty overwhelm him. He had to stay focused, find a way to overcome the challenges that lay before him, and keep moving forward, step by step, until he reached the desired summit. As time went on, Beck began to lose track of time and space. Each moment seemed to stretch into eternity. Each step taken was made only from a Herculean effort. But he refused to give up. He knew he had to keep fighting, even when everything seemed to be against him. That day he managed to advance, but to his misfortune, without a correct heading, he was on the opposite side of the climb for almost the largest part of the day, being out of sight of most of the teams that ventured towards the summit. And also, because of this, he didn't go down as much as he could. But luck seemed to change momentarily when a team of Australians descending from the summit spotted him, and experienced leader Nathan Uriah went to his aid. They accompanied Beck, who was walking with extreme difficulty, and that could be fatal for the whole team. So they took him to a strategic point and gave clear orders for him to wait there, because they had to go down, but they would send rescue. In this way, when they reached the 5,000-meter camp, a rescue team was sent to rescue him and another Japanese woman who had also been left in almost the same place. They were turbulent moments, for as he descended he felt that his body was alive, but the moment he stopped to wait for rescue, it was as if his body wanted again to nestle in the fatal embrace of death. That afternoon, when he was found, Beck had several parts of his body frozen and was one step away from a cold burn, unable to communicate, not even at that moment open his eyes, because all he dreamed was that he had already been rescued. In this way, considered near death but still breathing, he was left behind, to die a second time. But by some miracle at nightfall, his body woke up for the second time from a hypothermic coma, and a surge of adrenaline rushed through his body. Somehow miraculously, he pulled himself together and walked down the mountain, stumbling over feet that looked like porcelain and had almost no tactile sensation left. When he entered the 5,000-foot camp, the climbers were stunned. Although his face was blackened by the cold and his limbs were probably never the same, Beck Weathers was walking and at that moment, talking. As news of their survival returned to base camp, more shock ensued. The climber was not only walking and talking, but it seemed that he had returned from the dead. Immediately, he was referred to a hospital. After the tragedy on Mount Everest, Beck Weathers was rushed to a hospital, where his struggle for survival was far from over. His body was severely injured and frozen. His right arm, the fingers of his left hand, and several pieces of his feet had to be amputated, as well as his nose, which was reconstructed with tissue from his neck and ear. And after that, he would still face months of painful rehabilitation to fully recover. But even in the depths of pain and adversity, Beck found a fierce determination within himself to survive and recover. While struggling to recover from his injuries, Beck faced an equally difficult emotional battle. He was haunted by the memories of the storm on Everest, reliving the moments of terror and despair over and over in his mind. He wondered if he could have done something different, if he could have prevented the tragedy that befell his expedition. But even amid the darkness of his thoughts, Beck found a glimmer of hope. He clung to memories of the moments of courage and camaraderie he shared with his expedition companions, remembering the many times they supported each other in the midst of adversity. These memories helped him find the strength and inspiration to keep fighting, even in the darkest moments of his recovery journey. His body slowly healed from his wounds, and his mind strengthened with each small achievement along the way. He learned to walk again, to use his prosthetic limbs with skill and dexterity, and found a new determination to live fully despite the scars he carried with him. As he continued his journey of recovery, Beck also found support and comfort in his family and friends. His wife, who had stood by him during the darkest moments of his journey, helped him find hope and purpose in the midst of adversity. His children motivated him to keep fighting, reminding him of the love and joy that still existed in his life despite all the difficulties they faced. And then one day, when he least expected it, Beck made a startling discovery. He realized that his journey of recovery was not only about surviving, but also about finding meaning and redemption in the midst of tragedy. He realized that even in the depths of pain and suffering, there was still beauty and hope to be found, if only he had the courage to search. So, Armed with a new determination and a fresh perspective on life, Beck embarked on a journey of self-discovery and renewal. He dedicated himself to helping other survivors of similar tragedies by sharing his story of overcoming and inspiring others to find strength and hope in the midst of adversity. And in doing so, he discovered that while he may have been left for dead on the summit of Mount Everest, his true journey was just beginning. "They told me this trip would cost me an arm and a leg," Beck then said, when the whole whirlwind had passed. "So far, I've gotten a little better deal." Beck Weathers retired from mountaineering. Although he has never climbed all 7 peaks, he still feels he has come out on top. His wife, even enraged that she had been abandoned, agreed not to divorce and stayed by his side to take care of him. Beck Weathers travels the world giving lectures, and his story became known to everyone. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.